He rose from the desert with nothing, no shoes, no army, just a dream to rule. For 42 years he defied kings, the West, and even his own people. But how did Libya's liberator become its greatest tyrant? This is the rise and fall of Muammar Gaddafi.
The man the world would come to know as Muammar Gaddafi was born under the wide skies of Libya's western desert. His full name was Muammar Mohammed Abu Minya al-Gaddafi, though the spelling of his surname varies across languages. Gaddafi, Gaddafi, or Gaddafi, and remains symbolic of the many identities he tried to wear. His exact birth date is still debated. Most historians place it around 1941, but some suggest as early as the 1930s or as late as 1943. He was born into the Gaddafi tribe, a Bedouin Arab community that claimed to be descended from the Prophet Muhammad. His village, Qasr Bu Hadi, sat south of Sirte, far from the coastal cities, tucked into the harsh and empty stretches of desert. His family had little. No electricity, no running water, no formal home. Life was built on survival.
He was born in the desert, yes, but more importantly, he was born into myth. Gaddafi understood early how powerful origin stories are in Arab culture. He crafted his image not as a boy who grew up poor, but as someone destined by God to lead.
His father, Mohammed Abdul Salam bin Hamid, known as Abu Minyar, was a goat and camel herder, a subsistence nomad in every sense. His mother, Aisha bin Niran, was also of Bedouin roots. Theirs was a family of the rural poor, a class that formed the vast majority of Italian-controlled Libya in the early 20th century. The desert shaped Muammar. It taught him silence, patience, and how to endure, lessons he'd carry as both revolutionary and ruler. He was born into a country with a long memory of invasion and occupation. From the ancient Greeks and Romans to the Ottomans, Libya had been a prize for centuries. But it was the Italians, the last colonizers, who would cast the deepest shadow over Gaddafi's childhood. He would later write that his people feared the sea, refusing to go near it. Not out of superstition, but because the invaders always came from the sea, bearing foreign flags, strange tongues, and guns. The 20th century brought new chaos. After the Ottoman Empire declined, European powers looked greedily at Africa. In 1902, Italy claimed Libya during the imperial scramble for Africa. While Ottoman Tripoli had been semi-autonomous for years, now Libya was about to face a brutal colonization. By September 1911, Italian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Libya, seizing the coast with speed, but failing to dominate the vast hinterlands. What followed was a long, bloody resistance between local tribes loyal to the Ottomans and the Italian occupiers. The war dragged on for years. The Libyan resistance, particularly under leaders like Omar Mukhtar, became legendary. But despite their tenacity, the Italians, especially under Benito Mussolini, eventually tightened their grip. Mussolini's regime introduced modern infrastructure, but it came at a cultural cost. New roads and towns appeared, yet Libyan literature was suppressed. Arabic was discouraged, and tribal leaders were sidelined. The message was clear. Italy didn't want partners. It wanted subjects. During World War II, Libya became a battleground again, this time between the Axis and Allied powers. Some Libyans cooperated with the Allies, hoping for independence in return, but those hopes would be dashed once more. After the war, Libya was carved up into British and French spheres of control. Gaddafi was just a child, but he likely saw foreign soldiers walking his desert roads, commanding his towns. These early impressions of betrayal, occupation, and division would later fuel his politics. Libya eventually gained independence in 1951, with King Idris I crowned as monarch. But as oil was discovered, wealth flowed not to the people, but to foreign corporations and the king's inner circle. The young Gaddafi watched this with growing resentment. As he listened to his father's stories about Italian atrocities, another conflict stirred his anger: the creation of Israel in 1948. The Arab world's failure to stop the partition of Palestine would become a lifelong obsession for Gaddafi. Yet in the midst of Arab defeat, one man inspired hope: Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic Egyptian officer who overthrew King Farouk in 1952. Nasser's calls for pan-Arabism, social justice, and anti-imperialism ignited a fire in young Gaddafi. He became obsessed, devouring speeches, writing poems, and organizing his schoolmates. He believed Arab unity was the only path to freedom. By his teen years, Gaddafi was attending Saba High School in the Fezzan region. There, he formed a secret group he called the Central Committee. These teenage revolutionaries dreamed of toppling King Idris and building a republic based on Islam and nationalism. Their mission was clear: remove the Western-backed monarchy, liberate Libya, and follow Nasser's example. Gaddafi briefly studied history at the University of Tripoli, but his real focus was revolution. He expanded his network, recruiting young radicals from Tripoli, Misrata, Janzour, and other cities. These cells began planning a military coup. In 1963, the conspirators gathered for a secret meeting. There, they decided it was time to act. They began hiding weapons, rehearsing tactics, and planning their moment. At the Benghazi Military Academy, Gaddafi's reputation darkened. When a fellow cadet committed a sexual offense, Gaddafi allegedly ordered a brutal public punishment. The cadet was bound, shot, but left alive until an officer arrived to end it. It was a glimpse into the ruthless leader he would become. Still, his charisma couldn't be denied. Gaddafi saw himself as the chosen one, the man destined to liberate Libya. Then, in the early morning hours of September 1st, 1969, he struck. He was only 27 years old when he launched the coup that overthrew King Idris. The plan was executed with precision. Gaddafi saw it as divine will, recalling a verse from the Quran he had heard on the radio: Allah will not deny the faithful their reward.
It was bold, bloodless. Gaddafi came in like a hero straight out of Cairo radio. But make no mistake, this was a military man staging a military takeover. The revolution started clean. It didn't stay that way.
Gaddafi was only 27 when he overthrew a king. Do you believe age defines a leader? Tell us in the comments.
The coup was successful. The monarchy fell with barely a fight. Gaddafi and his fellow officers declared a new Arab republic, pledging to rid Libya of foreign control and build a society based on equality, Islam, and justice. The people, weary of corruption and colonialism, cheered. But not everyone was convinced. Some wondered, could these young, untested officers govern? Gaddafi quickly made his intentions clear. He took the title of colonel, refusing to become a general. It was a deliberate echo of Nasser. He would rule not as king, but as revolutionary in chief. Yet soon, promises of democracy faded. Gaddafi seized control of the military, and sidelined civilian leaders. Former comrades who expected shared power began to realize this revolution had only one leader. He moved fast. Casinos and nightclubs were shut down. Alcohol was banned. In 1972, Sharia law replaced the secular system. Gaddafi launched the Islamic Call Society, using oil money to spread Libya's influence and his version of Islam across Africa and the Middle East. Many Libyans rejoiced at this moral awakening, but others saw their freedoms stripped away, their voices silenced. As dissent grew, Gaddafi launched a cultural revolution to reinvigorate his rule. He declared all previous laws void and introduced 5 new revolutionary principles enforced by loyal revolutionary committees. Then came the Green Book, his political manifesto, a blend of Islamic socialism, anti-capitalism, and tribal democracy. He presented it as a universal truth, a third path between East and West. He argued that capitalism exploited and communism enslaved. His system, he claimed, would free people through direct democracy.
His Green Book promised a better world. Some called it genius, others madness. What's your take? Drop your thoughts below.
The Green Book also laid out his social theories. He promoted the family unit, claimed to support women's rights, yet insisted women were primarily mothers and caretakers. Critics called it contradictory, even hypocritical, but for Gaddafi, it was doctrine. In 1977, he renamed the country the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, the only nation in the world with no official president or prime minister. Just brother leader. The national flag became a plain green rectangle.
The Green Book was less of a
symbolizing
constitution and
Gaddafi's
more of a
purity
sermon.
of vision.
It wasn't built
Even
for
Fidel
governance.
Castro was invited
It was
to
built
celebrate
to
this
justify
new
power.
era.
Gaddafi turned ideas into commandments and his contradictions into sacred truths.
Despite his speeches about people-led governance, Gaddafi remained at the top of the pyramid. He controlled everything: laws, military, oil, and increasingly, people's lives. Local committees were formed, but they often lacked power or participation. To maintain order and silence opposition, Gaddafi announced in 1978 a new split between revolutionary authority and people's authority. This was largely symbolic. In practice, the revolutionary cells, filled with his loyalists, still held all power. He resigned from formal office in 1979, but it was a performance. He retained control as commander of the armed forces and placed his most loyal associates, tribal allies and relatives, in key positions. One of the most important creations during this phase was the Revolutionary Committee's liaison office. Headed by his relative Mohammed Majdoub, this office was the nerve center of surveillance and loyalty enforcement. It oversaw all revolutionary activity. No one could act without clearance from above. Gaddafi's paranoia only deepened. Private business was nationalized. Property was confiscated. Dissenters were arrested or executed. He devastated Libya's fragile economy by crushing what little private commerce remained. Consumer goods became scarce. Imported items vanished. Entire generations grew up knowing only the state as provider, educator, censor, and enforcer. To Gaddafi, grand projects were proof of legitimacy. He pursued desert irrigation, nuclear programs, and giant public works. Students were conscripted, industries militarized. Whether or not his ideas were practical didn't matter. Obedience did. He ruled Libya with iron precision. He shuffled government offices at will, inventing titles like Brother Leader of the Great Revolution Power wasn't delegated. It was owned. Gaddafi imagined himself not just as Libya's leader, but as the voice of all Arabs. He saw himself as a modern Bismarck or Cavour, destined to unite the Arab world. Though pan-Arabism had faded in the region, Gaddafi remained obsessed. While other nations moved forward, he clung to a 19th-century-style nationalism, believing Libya was to lead Arabs into glory.
You didn't speak. You whispered. You taught your children to lie. The revolutionary committees weren't just guards. They were nightmares with state approval. We lived in fear of people who once sat at our dinner tables.
As Gaddafi's dreams of Arab unity faced resistance, he grew more radical. He began supporting militant groups across the Middle East and Africa. Terrorism became, to him, a legitimate tool to fight imperialism. He backed Palestinian militants. He gave arms and funding to groups opposing Western and Christian-backed governments in Africa. By the 1980s, his involvement in terrorism was undeniable. The Berlin disco bombing in 1986, which killed 2 American soldiers and a Turkish woman, was linked directly to Libya. Western governments were furious. Gaddafi shrugged it off, stating, "Some people will die and be forgotten, but the result will be that right will triumph." The United States responded with Operation El Dorado Canyon, bombing Tripoli and Benghazi. Gaddafi barely survived. His adopted daughter died in the attack. But the strike made him more defiant and more isolated.
He funded rebels, backed bombings, and played the madman in front of cameras. But behind it all was cold calculation. Gaddafi knew fear bought time, and time bought power.
Just as the world began turning its back, disaster struck. Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people. Investigations linked the bombing to Libyan intelligence. Gaddafi was outraged, insisting Libya was innocent. But by the 1990s, mounting evidence and international pressure forced him to accept responsibility and pay compensation, without admitting guilt. Still, his speeches grew more fiery. He cast himself as the last defender of oppressed people, the only one standing against Western hypocrisy. Internally, however, even his own people began turning against him. When members of the Warfala tribe, once close to his regime, were accused of plotting a coup, Gaddafi responded viciously. He forced televised confessions, had their families punished, and their homes destroyed. The message was clear: betrayal would be crushed. Rumors swirled of another coup. Gaddafi grew nervous. In 1996, rebels nearly assassinated him in Brak by throwing a grenade. He survived and retaliated with a scorched earth campaign, targeting not just rebels, but anyone remotely associated with them. The revolutionary committees returned to their most violent form, broadcasting executions on television to instill fear. Meanwhile, Gaddafi's inner circle worried. Sanctions were crippling the economy. Oil revenues dropped. Food was scarce. They pushed him to make deals with the West, to reform, at least in appearance. By 2004, Libya re-established diplomatic relations with the United States. Gaddafi promised to abandon weapons of mass destruction and even cooperated on counter-terrorism. But behind the scenes, nothing really changed. Reforms were surface level. His son Saif al-Islam tried to present a modern face, but Gaddafi never let go of control. Most Libyans remained poor, repressed, and utterly dependent on the state. The illusion of progress fooled the West for a while. In 2011, inspired by revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, Libya began to tremble. Protests broke out in Benghazi. The people no longer wanted reform. They wanted an end to the regime. On February 17th, Gaddafi's forces opened fire on demonstrators. Dozens were killed. But the next day, more returned. The revolution had begun. Former ministers, technocrats, and even defected military officers formed the National Transitional Council, NTC, to unite the opposition. Though lacking arms and training, they had momentum and international attention. Gaddafi tried to negotiate through Saif. He promised democracy, elections, but no one believed him. It was too late. His legacy was stained with blood and lies. He denounced the NTC as traitors and agents of foreign powers, but his speeches rang hollow. The world watched as his regime crumbled.
When we marched in Benghazi, we knew we might not come back. But for the first time in my life, I felt like a citizen, not a subject. That first chant, "The people want the regime to fall," still echoes inside me.
From hero to tyrant, was Gaddafi ever truly for the people or just for power? Like this video if you're still watching, and subscribe for more stories like this one.
After months of war, Gaddafi's final stand came in his hometown of Sirte. Surrounded and out of options, he was captured by rebels hiding in a drainpipe. A teenage fighter shot him. His lifeless body was dragged through the streets, jeered at, spat on, then displayed in Misrata, a grim trophy marking the end of an era. Gaddafi had ruled for 42 years. He came from the desert to take over a kingdom, preached freedom, but delivered tyranny. His fall was as brutal as his reign. The fall of Gaddafi was shocking, not just because of the brutality, but because of how suddenly the man who claimed absolute control lost it all. For 4 decades, he ruled Libya as though it were his personal empire, rewriting laws, books, and even history itself. Yet in the end, it wasn't a superpower or foreign army that toppled him. It was his own people, fed up with oppression, lies, and stagnation. But victory came at a cost. Libya collapsed into chaos almost immediately. Weapons once hoarded by Gaddafi's military were now in the hands of militias. Tribal rivalries and ideological factions exploded into open conflict. The institutions he destroyed in the name of revolution had never been rebuilt. There was no real army, no judicial system, no civil society strong enough to take over. Gaddafi had made sure of that. He had ruled through control, not structure. So when he was gone, there was nothing left to stand. To many Arabs, Gaddafi remains a confusing figure. Some saw him as a symbol of resistance, a man who defied Western domination, spoke out against imperialism, and dreamed of Arab unity. Others saw him as a delusional tyrant who spent oil wealth on vanity projects and foreign wars while his people suffered. His speeches, once passionate, often turned erratic, conspiratorial, and confusing. The Arab world had moved on from Nasser-era dreams of pan-Arabism. Gaddafi hadn't. His obsession with ideology blinded him to the changes around him. He became a man out of time. In the West, Gaddafi was long seen as a madman with money. He was both laughed at and feared. Cartoons mocked his outfits and female bodyguards. Yet politicians still negotiated with him, because Libya had oil, and Gaddafi knew how to play the game. He was unpredictable, flirting with reform one year, supporting rebels the next, then pledging loyalty to Islam, while cracking down on Muslim groups. Diplomats never knew if they'd meet a visionary leader or an egotistical showman. But behind all the performance, Gaddafi represented a truth many leaders feared: that a single man with enough oil, fear, and control could shape a nation in his own image, for decades. More than anything, Gaddafi's legacy is a warning. He blurred the line between state and self. His ideology became law. His opinions became policy. He built schools only to rewrite their textbooks. He abolished parliaments, then replaced them with people's committees that answered only to him. He didn't just rule Libya, he absorbed it. When he was gone, there was nothing left but a vacuum.
He erased everything: courts, parliaments, parties. So when he fell, there was nothing left but raw survival instincts. The state didn't collapse in 2011. It had been hollowed out years before.
The 2011 revolution was supposed to bring democracy. Instead, it opened the floodgates to more violence. Rival governments rose and fell. Foreign powers meddled. Militias replaced ministries. Some Libyans still speak of hope, of building something new, of finally choosing their leaders. But the road is long, and the scars run deep. What Gaddafi left behind wasn't just physical ruins, though there are many. He left a people traumatized by surveillance, suspicious of politics, and afraid of false messiahs. He didn't just steal wealth.
The West tolerated Gaddafi until he became inconvenient. Then came the jets, the resolutions, and the silence when Libya fractured. Regime change is the easy part. What comes next? That's the story no one stays for.
He stole trust. Today, Gaddafi's name evokes mixed emotions. In parts of Africa, he's still praised for infrastructure projects and Pan-African unity. In Libya, older generations remember stability, but also fear. Younger Libyans, born under his shadow, want something different. For historians, Gaddafi is a case study in how revolutionary zeal can become authoritarian rule. How a man who once dreamed of justice can become the very thing he fought against. And how easy it is to believe you're freeing your people, when, in fact, you're enslaving them to your vision. Muammar Gaddafi rose from the desert, barefoot, hungry, poor. He brought down a king. He challenged the West. He claimed to speak for all Arabs, all Africans, even all mankind. He ruled with vision, with violence, with vanity. He died alone, in a ditch, betrayed, broken, beaten. A cautionary tale, a lesson carved in sand, a dictator undone by his own revolution. From a barefoot Bedouin boy to a ruthless ruler, Muammar Gaddafi's story is one of ambition, revolution, and betrayal. His rise shook the world. His fall shocked it. What do you think his legacy really means? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold history.